What's up guys, it's Paraly5er here, and welcome to another video. Today we're going to be doing an updated version of the tier list for the melee weapons for Grounded 1.2.4. Reminder, this is my opinion. I'll be ranking these weapons on a few different factors, mostly how good they are in the game, damage-wise, for killing things, you know, that's what weapons are for. But also partially to do with how easy they are to get, and other factors, you know, if I enjoy using them, whether you can use a shield with them, you know, one-handed versus two-handed, the different mutations you can use with them, those sorts of things. I'm going to do this slightly differently to some of the other tier lists we've done, where I'm going to start by ranking all the tier 1 weapons, then I'll remove them from the list, and we'll rank all the tier 2 weapons, and I'll remove them from the list, and then we'll rank all the tier 3 weapons, because some people last time couldn't comprehend the fact that I put a spiky sprig above something like a widow dagger. Obviously, the Widow Dagger is stronger, but I was just ranking them based on tiers. So let's go ahead and get straight into it. First, we have the tier 1 weapons, which are all at the bottom of the screen right here, finishing on the Pebblet Dagger, of course. Now, first we have the Acorn. Really? Why did I put this on the list? I don't know. It is technically a tier 1 weapon, right? I included it on the list for that reason, but it's the worst one on the list. Like, yeah. Don't use this. The only time I use this as a weapon is if I didn't bring a dagger with me and I go into the water and there's like a water flea or something that's annoying me, and I'll just kill it with a shovel. But yeah, I wouldn't recommend you use this as a weapon whatsoever. Next we have the Lava Blade. Unlike some of the other weapons on this list, this one actually requires to get some lava spikes. But obviously, if you're good at the game and you're in the early game, it's pretty easy to get. It does inflict poison damage on your enemy, and it counts as a blade, which means it works with Blade Master. I'm going to put this one in A tier. This is one of the best tier 1 weapons. The poison damage is really good, because having some sort of poison early in the game is useful. Damage over time effects are really nice, in particular for enemies that run away, like the worker ants. It's not too difficult to get. You do need a shovel to get it, ironically, because you need grub hide. But I do recommend using it early in the game, particularly if you're a one-handed weapon user. It's probably the best tier 1 one-handed weapon here. Next we have the Pebblet Axe. I'm going to put this in B tier. The Pebblet Axe is really, really easy to get. It's the very first thing you craft in Grounded most of the time. Obviously, you're going to need one anyway to cut stuff down, so I would highly recommend them. I obviously use it when I'm killing like bombardiers, for example, early in the game because they're weak to chopping. Problem with chopping is that a lot of enemies are resistant to it, but I've proven in some of the videos I've made in the past that axes are actually really OP despite a lot of enemies being resistant to chopping damage. And the Pebblet Axe is no different, so it's going to be a solid B tier from me. The reason I prefer the Lava Blade is just that damage over time effect is quite nice. The problem with the Pebblet Axe is enemies will run away, although Chopper is a good choice of mutation, which is pretty good if you can get it. Spiky Sprig is the S tier of tier 1 weapons. It is the best tier 1 weapon available, and that is just straight facts. Now, for those who didn't know, this did recently get changed in 1.2, I think it was, where now it actually has a bleed effect. So when you hit an enemy with it, it will give it a bleed damage effect over time. This is a very, very strong effect, and similar to the Lava Blade, it actually is going to kill enemies that run away, like the ants. But why is it better than the Lava Blade? Well, it just does more damage. It's as simple as that. It is a two-handed weapon, and it's a club, and clubs are notorious for doing a lot of damage in this game. Another thing that makes it really good is when you throw it, it does a lot of damage, and it also will stun enemies with every throw. So if an enemy starts attacking, and you throw the spiky sprig at it, it will stun most enemies. Doesn't work for bosses, but it does work for a lot of the early game enemies, which is what you'll be using these tier 1 weapons on. Pebblet Hammer is D as well. Now you're probably thinking it's a bit harsh to put it in the same tier as the Acorn Shovel, but hammers are just rubbish. They are way, way, way too slow. If you play the game like pre 1.0, maybe in the Bug Strike back, you'll know hammers actually used to be pretty quick weapons and they were pretty good. Now they're just absolutely horrible, and I wouldn't wish a hammer on my worst enemy. It's a D tier weapon, it's not a good choice, even though it is really easy to get. Next we have the Pebblet Spear. I'm going to put this in B tier as well with the Pebblet Axe. Now, the spear doesn't do as much damage as the axe, but it does do stabbing damage, and it's also just as easy to get. The reason I'm putting it in B is because you can throw it for quite a lot of damage, and if you have Javelineer, it's also going to boost the damage of the throw. So, I'd rate this weapon pretty highly. I'd particularly say craft a few of them early in the game, is usually what I do, and then just throw them at my enemies like stink bugs and ants, and it's a really effective way of killing them. Finally, for the tier 1 weapons, we have the Pebblet Dagger. Now this, for me, I think I'm just going to put this in C tier. It's got a very similar speed and damage to the Pebblet Spear, except it can't be thrown, so it's got less effectiveness. Next up, let's do the tier 2 weapons. So there's a few more tier 2 weapons than there were tier 1. It actually goes and covers my face cam's covering the Red Ant Club, but we'll go through them nonetheless. We'll start with the Insect Hammer. I'm going to put this in D tier as well, and I'm also going to put the Black Ant Shovel in D tier already. Again, they're very similar to the tier 1 counterparts. There's not really much to go over here. They're a little more expensive to craft. You do obviously need the hammer for certain things in the game, like milk molders and stuff, but we're talking solely in terms of weapons and damage. Don't use either of these to kill anything. I just wouldn't do it. It's not worth it. Next, we have the Bone Trident. I'm going to put this in C. The reason the Bone Trident is in C tier is I very rarely craft it. If I want a tier 2 spear, the Stinger Spear is a much better choice, as although it doesn't provide the stun that the Bone Trident does, it does have a chance to crit more often than the Bone Trident does, which is its special ability. Bone Trident doesn't have any special abilities. Is it a bad weapon per se? No, but there's another spear in tier 2 that is better than it by quite some margin, although it is a little harder to get. Usually though, if I'm underwater, I'll use the Bone Dagger. Now the reason for this is because it has utility underwater, because it can chop through soggy roots. I'm going to put this in B tier. Now, again, the same reason as the Bone Trident that it's not going to go in A tier is because there's another weapon in tier 2 that is a better version of this, so it can't go in A tier. I'm going to put the Insect Axe in A tier. I think the recipe is pretty easy. It's a ladybug head. It is 3 silk rope, I think, and also it is some bombardier parts. Pretty easy to get. You know, you can use your tier 1 axe to kill the bombardiers to get the tier 2 axe. It's very, very nice. You can also get those parts from web sacks in the hedge. As I've said, axes are very effective. People massively underrate axes in the game. They do a lot more damage than you think, even though a lot of enemies are resistant to chopping. It's a one-handed weapon. The chopper mutation is really good when combined with it, so it's a solid A tier weapon. Next, we have my controversial take. Some people love the mosquito needle. I, on the other hand, have endured the pain of using this weapon. I'm going to put it in C tier. Now, I have done like 5 different videos where I test every single tier 3 weapon. I know that the mosquito needle is tier 2, but I've used the tiger mosquito needle, which is a better version to kill every single enemy, and it is by far the lowest DPS of any weapon in the game. Now, I do know that it provides lifesteal to the player, which is really useful to some of you who like to just go all out and get hit all the time. But personally, I prefer perfect blocking attacks and not getting hit. So the lifesteal for me is not something I choose to use. The reason it's in C is because it does have lifesteal. If it didn't have lifesteal, it'd be a D tier weapon, it'd be the worst weapon in the game. But it does have lifesteal, there is a slight upside to it, so I'm going to put it in C tier. The other big issue with this weapon is the durability is horrendous. It breaks unbelievably quickly. Next, we have the Black Ant Sword. I'm actually going to put this in S tier. When combined with the Blade Master mutation, this weapon is lethal. It isn't the easiest to craft. You do have to beat some black ants in order to make it, but it is a really, really powerful weapon. It doesn't have any special effects, unlike some of the other tier 2 weapons, but it is just a really strong sword. And when paired with a Black Ant Shield, it is a lethal combination. I'm going to put the Stinger Spear in A tier. Now this is the Bone Trident, except it does more crit damage. You have to obviously kill some bees to get it, which is a bit of a pain, but it is really, really strong. It is the best spear choice in tier 2, and it's a very good weapon. It's not perfect though, so that is why it is in A tier. Next we have the Spider Fang Dagger, and I'm going to put this in S tier. Now, a while ago I wouldn't have rated this as highly, but the reason this dagger is just so good is the bleed damage over time from Assassin now is really, really strong. The poison effect you give from it is really good. It attacks really quickly, which is good for crit builds as well. You can build really, really good dagger builds in the game right now, and in terms of DPS, they're one of the highest DPS weapons in the game. Finally, we have the Red Ant Club. I can't put the Red Ant Club anywhere other than S tier, I'm sorry. Clubs in this game, they are one of those weapons that you would call a high skill weapon. It's two-handed, which means you can't use a shield with it, so you have to be very good at perfect blocking while using them. But clubs, objectively, just do the most damage. That is just a fact. They do the most damage per hit, and if you're blocking between combos and you're attacking really quickly, you can do a lot of damage in a short space of time with a club. And I'm a big fan of clubs in this game, so they are a S tier weapon. Also, quick side note, if we had fists as one of our choices, I know I didn't include it, it would be D tier now. It's dreadful. Fists are useless, okay? Now we move on to the tier 3 weapons. Now, obviously, this category has the most weapons of any of them, and it is one of the most hotly contested categories of them all. So let's see what I think of some of these weapons. First, we have the Antlion Greatsword. Now, this weapon is sort of unique in a sense. It is a two-handed slashing weapon. Obviously, the Cortana is also two-handed and slashing, but the difference there is that is spicy by default. This has no element. Now, this weapon's pretty easy to get. All you have to do is kill some antlions. The biggest problem I have with it is it costs a lot of antlion pincers, and if you get unlucky, you're going to have to kill like 15 to 20 antlions to get it. I'm going to say it's a C tier weapon. I don't often craft this. I very rarely use it. It is not one I go for whatsoever. I can understand there are some perks to using it, but it's not one for me, so it's going to be a C tier, even though it's two-handed and it is pretty strong. The Black Ox Hammer is going in D tier. Again, hammers aren't weapons. Don't use them as weapons, use them as a tool. They don't do enough damage, they don't attack quick enough. Something like a club will always outperform a hammer in terms of damage. Speaking of clubs, we have the Club of the Mother Demon. Ooh, where do I put this? I'm going to keep it in S. Now, Venom did get a nerf, so when using this with Apex Predator, it's not as powerful as it was. But it just still is one of the best weapons in the game. It is extremely powerful. You can make it, obviously, into any element that you like. And for me, I always carry these, and even into the end game of Grounded, I will use a Club of the Mother Demon. It is an S tier weapon. Next, we have the Fire Ant Club, which is a slightly weaker version of this. It also requires you to kill fire ants to get it. I'm going to put it in B tier. It's not a terrible weapon. It's a decent choice, but I wouldn't really recommend using it. The special effect of this weapon is like crit stun or something. It's really not that useful, and for that reason, I wouldn't recommend using it. I think it's easier to kill the Broodmother and get the Club of the Mother Demon than it is to make the Fire Ant Club. So for that reason, it's going to go in B tier. Next, we have the Mint Mace. This is also an S tier weapon. It's actually a more powerful version of the Club of the Mother Demon, but the difference being it can only be made fresh. So, it is just the best fresh weapon in the game. The only downside is you can't get the Apex Predator effect like you do on the club, but it's really powerful. Definitely an S tier weapon as well. Pinchwhacker. Now, last time I think that I put this in B or C tier. This is an S tier. You can get this, like, before you can get most tier 2 weapons in the game. You can literally go to the Black Ant Hill, get some fungal growth, some red ant eggs, make a bomb, go open up the secret lab and get it, and it is one of the best weapons to use. I always use this for taking on the assistant manager. I'll always use it when taking on the Broodmother, and then I'll make a Club of the Mother Demon. The only downside to this weapon is it can't really carry you into the late game of Grounded. But I wouldn't really consider this a late game weapon. I consider this an early game Grounded weapon. So for that reason, I would say use it up until you get to the late game. You could argue that I should move it down to A tier maybe. Yeah, for that reason actually I am going to move it down to A, just because it's not going to be great in the late game of Grounded, beating some of the really difficult bosses, but it is a really good weapon to get in the early game to carry you through to the late game. Next we have the Prod Smacker. Now getting this weapon is extremely painful. You have to beat every super mixer, but there is a good set of armor you can use with the Black Ox armor with charged attacks for this that stuns enemies really frequently. I would say this is a solid B tier. The reason it's a B tier is because it is so difficult to get the full set to prepare this build that it is not worth the effort of getting it. But once you do get it, it is really good build. This weapon is pretty strong. The problem is, it's a really high stun weapon, and stun got massively nerfed recently where every enemy now has a stun cooldown, which is really annoying. But yeah, it's still a solid B tier weapon. Next we have the Rusty Spear. This one's pretty easy to craft, it's pretty powerful. I'm going to say A tier. It's not quite S tier for me, but it is verging on the edge of it. I really do like this weapon. I think it's really strong. I particularly like to use a sour one when I'm underwater in the late game, as it one-shots the spiny water fleas. The thing stopping it from getting to S tier is that there are a lot of enemies resistant to stabbing, and this massively reduces the damage it does against certain enemies like Black Ox Beetles and Roly-Polies and those sorts of things. So for that reason, it's not quite S tier, but it definitely is an A tier choice. Next, we have the Salt Morning Star. Now, this one is a recipe you get from within the sandbox. Very easy to get. You can get it quite early on. Obviously, you have to get the globs to get it, so you have to have at least beat the assistant manager. I'm going to say that this is an A tier weapon. It is a club that is one-handed, which technically means you can use Barbarian with it with little risk. It is a very strong weapon. It actually did get buffed in 1.1, I do believe. I really do like this weapon. I think it's a really strong weapon, and it's a good choice for a salty weapon in particular. The only downside being it's not quite as powerful as those in S tier, like the Club of the Mother Demon, which does much more damage than it and can also be made salty. Next, we have the Scythe of Blossoms. Now, to get this, you have to beat the Mantis, who is really broken. Is this necessary? It's a tier 3 axe. Okay, that's cool, but you already have a tier 3 axe by the time you beat the Mantis, let's be honest. The unique thing about this weapon is that it does both chopping and slashing damage if you upgrade it mighty, which is pretty cool. Once you upgrade it down an elemental path though, I do believe it loses the chopping value and is only a slashing weapon at that point. It is really good with the Apex Predator mutation. I'm going to put it in B tier. I don't think it's an amazing weapon, but I think with the right build, with the right combinations, it can be effective. It is just a pain to get, which is the main issue I have, and you have to have Apex Predator with it for the extra speed, which means you're going to have to beat the Mantis. So it's going to be a really late game weapon. You might use it against something like the Infected Broodmother, if you're really good at the game, because the other issue is it is a two-handed weapon, which means to use this, you're going to have to be really skilled as well. The Sour Battle Axe. I'm going to put this in C tier. This is a bang average weapon. It's really not that good. Obviously, it's stuck sour, and sour is only really effective on the final defense or against orc enemies in the game. Obviously, you can't use it underwater against things like the spiny water fleas. So for that reason, it's a C tier. It is a bang average weapon. I very rarely craft it, and I would not recommend it. Next, we have the Spicy Kultana. Now, this is slashing and spicy. You have to do a lockdown event just to get it, and I'm going to put it in B tier. It is a two-handed weapon, which obviously involves extra risk, and something like the Club of the Mother Demon does more damage when upgraded spicy, and is easier to get and just a better overall choice. And so for that reason, I think the Kultana being difficult to get and the lower damage than the Club of the Mother Demon just doesn't really suit well anymore, and for that reason it's going to be a B tier. It's also slashing, which, say for example the Club of the Mother Demon, not a lot of enemies are resistant to generic damage at all, whereas when it comes to slashing there is quite a few that are resistant to it, which can be a pain. Next we have the Termite Axe. I'm actually going to put this in A tier. This is a really strong, underrated weapon. It finished really highly in all of my tests that I did, that I've done in the past. I did them in 1.0 obviously, but a lot of that still carries through. A lot of the numbers are still very similar nowadays. So for that reason, it's an A tier weapon. It's really strong. It's one of the ones you're obviously going to get because you need a tier 3 axe, and it's pretty easy to get, to be completely honest with you. It's one of the first tier 3 weapons you'll find yourself collecting. So for that reason, it's definitely an A tier. 4 weapons left, and some of them are going to be controversial. We have the Tick Maka Waka Weewa. Now, this thing's pretty easy to get, but I'm not a fan of it. I'm going to put it in C tier, to be honest. I'm also going to put the Tiger Mosquito Rapier in C tier as well. These are both one-handed weapons. They both do lifesteal. The difference is one is slashing and one is stabbing. I don't like either of them. They both have really low damage compared to every other weapon on this list. The only advantage to them is the lifesteal, and as I've said, lifesteal is not my kind of build. I prefer to just not get hit and then do a lot of damage in return. Next, we have 2 more weapons which are really powerful. First, we have the Toenail Scimitar. Now, toenails are a pain to get, and this thing, I do believe, costs 10 to craft, which is really expensive. They take a long time to respawn, but it's completely worth it. In fact, I'd recommend using the Super Duper to dupe toenails. This is one of the best weapons in the game. The infection from this weapon reduces enemies' attack speed and damage by 10%, which is really useful. It's a one-handed weapon, meaning you can block a lot of attacks, and it works with Blade Master, which means you're going to recover your stamina really quickly. This thing literally shreds through so many enemies in the game, and I would recommend maybe even getting these in multiple elements to use against certain enemies. You could have a spicy one for a wolf spider and a fresh one for the infected wolf spider. Finally, we have the Widow Dagger. Now, last time I think I put this in D because of how difficult Super Spider Venom is to get. But now, it's a lot easier to get Super Spider Venom using the Dissection, Expert Mutation, and Stuffed Black Widows to increase your loot drops. This dagger is really good. I'm actually going to put it in A tier. Now, the bleed poison combination is really good with this thing. I still do think it is a little difficult to craft, and you're going to have to get relatively late into the game to get it. But I do think it's a really good choice of weapon. I think any of the weapons in A and S tier are viable choices for the end game of Grounded, for killing some of the most difficult bosses. But I'd say anything B and below isn't really going to cut it towards the end of the game. So that's the complete tier list for tiers 1, 2, and 3 melee weapons in Grounded. If you enjoyed, don't forget to leave a like on it. Don't roast me too hard in the comments, but feel free to leave your own opinions. There's obviously a link to the tier list in the description that I made if you want to make your own tier lists. And I'll see you in the next Grounded video. Have a great rest of your day.